friends, this is your seat at the table, and this is the 4th of July for 2022, and I'm going to do a couple different videos today. We have some friends coming over this afternoon doing a cookout and things like that. It's a bit rainy. It's starting out as a raining holiday. Anyway, if any of you guys have had a chance to go back and look at some of my older video lists that I have one called Twilight 2000. And it's for an awesome game system that was created back in the 90s. And unfortunately, I never really got an opportunity to get anybody to take a good serious play, sit down and play a game with it, which is kind of sad, kind of always bummed me out a little bit. Anyway, one of the premises about the game system was it was established in roughly mid to late 80s. World War III breaks out between the Soviet Union, USSR, and NATO forces, and everything goes south from there. And your unit is what's left of a NATO force trapped in Poland, and the war is more or less a wash for everybody. Everything's gone to crap, and now your sole purpose is really to find a way home. There's a great premise. It, of course, is now set in an alternate reality, obviously, because that sort of thing never occurred, even though we have a current environment today where we are never very far from the possibility of a horrific world-changing event that's man-made. And that's something we all try to ignore or to downplay or to avoid becoming obsessed with it. But some people become obsessed with it for a reason. And some people do so with the intention of figuring out a way to survive it. And in the 80s, they came out this series of books called The Survivalist. And I was reading these books long before Twilight 2000 came out. So when the Twilight 2000, the 2K game system came out, one of the things I thought about was, well, this is a good set of rules for alternate post-apocalyptic scenarios. Right, there are game systems like The Walking Dead and things like this. The White Wolf put out a series of games that was also considered post-apocalyptic that covered different genres of different things, the zombie apocalypse, that kind of stuff. And they're all good systems. I actually played White Wolf's version of the zombie apocalypse for a short window because a friend of mine had it, and it turned out to be pretty decent. But anyway, getting back to the Survivalist, this particular book system, and there were some 50 novels altogether that was put together by this Jerry Ahern, and I may not be pronouncing his name correctly. And as you see, they're just shy of a novelette. I mean, they're not massive books, 200 plus pages on average. But the premise basically is John Rourke, the primary player in the scenario, is quite a character. He's a bit of a jack of all trades with some pretty extensive skill sets. He started out he wanted to be a surgeon and a doctor, and he studied and even completed his education and started into an internship, and then decided that maybe he could do something more to help promote world peace and stability by becoming involved in the CIA somehow. So he goes to the CIA. The CIA sends him down to Latin America, where he goes through a couple pretty horrific scenarios. And in one of them, more or less his entire group is massacred by some KGB agents. He then retires. At this point, he becomes this self-made survival expert and weapons specialist expert, and he offers his services to various military and civilian police agencies as an expert for training their people on how to survive scenarios and situations, both in wilderness survival, urban survival, and how to deal with terrorists and counterterrorism and things like this. In the process, at some point along the way, he gets married and has 2 children. His wife is an artist and an illustrator and a children's book writer. And the two of them do not see eye to eye on a lot of things, especially his nihilist mindset that sooner or later the world's going to go to shit and he needs to be prepared for it. So, in his obsession with guns, she really has a problem with this, which is kind of ironic because I get the impression that he would have been that kind of person when they started dating. So why that didn't just carry through, I don't know. Anyway, so from a Twilight 2000 perspective, instead of your opportunity of your group starting in Europe, there's also other alternate scenarios. And the way this plays out in Survivor or Survivalist is the Russians are having a bad day in Afghanistan, as real world history knows. And one of those reasons that is similar to some of the problems that the U.S. government dealt with for 2 decades was the very porous borders between Pakistan and Afghanistan. The fact that freedom fighters, quote, freedom fighters, could easily slip back and forth across the border and go back into areas where the Russians couldn't follow, could also bring weapons and other materials and things across the border in sufficient numbers to make occupation of Afghanistan just not very tenable at all. And the Russians had some political and security reasons, they said, for invading and occupying Afghanistan in the first place. What they don't talk about in real world, and in the novel, it comes out that they had some pretty secret or very important research facilities in the bordering areas that they controlled on the other side of Afghanistan, and they were worried about the issues of things like what would be the Taliban and other organizations that were trying to raise holy Cain amongst the Arab-speaking members of their populations and causing problems. So this is why they originally went to Afghanistan, according to their story. So to put a stop to all this stuff crossing the border, the Russians move into Pakistan. And their intentions are to occupy a couple 100-kilometer wide area of the border to shut down access to Afghanistan from the Pakistani side of things. And that was their furthest, they'd actually reached the furthest extent of their, quote, incursion of in this operation. At this point, the Western allies, specifically the President of the United States at that time, which was a fictional character, of course, in the novel, put an ultimatum on them that they needed to get out, and that otherwise NATO would induce forces into Pakistan as part of some treaties that they had to force the Russians out. And the Russians warned the West that they weren't going to move, and to do so would just incite more violence and more likely lead to a catastrophic world war. And they also quietly warned the West, the president, that they had just recently finished developing a very experimental particle projection weapon, which now ranked Moscow and would protect them from any kind of ICBMs and strategic bombers and things like this. The American president and the American intelligence service did not believe that this was possible, that they said that the Russians were many years away from improving on this device to making it practical, etc. Where the truth was, it was extremely experimental, but they proceeded with deploying it anyway, just on the hopes it would work. And they did a secret test, and the test was successful. This gave them a sense of superiority. Well, things go south. Meanwhile, our protagonist is on a plane. He's in Canada, actually, doing a seminar with the Mounties on winter survival and anti-terrorist tactics and things like this, when he starts getting wind of some of the stuff going down and gets worried. Things are heating up in a big hurry, and suddenly there's an incident between two nuclear submarines out at sea under the ice pack, and nobody can be sure if one of them fired on each other or if they had an accident, ran into each other. This escalates problems. So increasing numbers of the various militaries are put on alert, and more bombers are put into the air, etc., etc. So John Rourke decides it's time to get on a plane and fly home. get home to his family, and then take his family to his, quote, retreat. So long before this big popular fad of the last 20 years of building survival retreats and the survivalist, the prepper fad, which is it's a fad, but it's based in some solid science and solid world social issue understanding. I mean, there are so many possible scenarios. This recent pandemic could have been 10 times more horrific or 100 times more horrific, as our science fiction likes to talk about. It could very well have happened, still could happen. And that's just one possible scenario. A total economic collapse of the world's economy. You can imagine what kind of chaos that would create. I mean, that is also a real possibility. So, anyway, John Rourke had spent the past 10 or 6 years or so investing every spare coin he could into building himself this personal retreat, as he called it, his personal prepper bunker. His bunker's built into a small mountain in the Georgia up in the Georgia mountains near the border of the state. And his wife, he had never convinced his wife to accompany him to it, so she didn't know where the location was. Now, even in purchasing his property, John was conscious of the possibilities of worst case scenarios. So he bought the family, quote, farm in an area of Georgia that was about 75 miles northwest of Atlanta, specifically in an area where he believed that if a nuclear fallout war was to occur, nuclear fallout would likely blow in the other direction, etc., etc. Of course, he's not 100% perfect. He's not a specialist in that sort of thing, but he did his damnedest. So Rourke finds himself on a plane. In the middle of his flight's diverted, and the pilot comes on saying that they've been warned that there's been a massive intercontinental ballistic launch between the two major superpowers, and they were no longer going to land at Atlanta, so they were being diverted somewhere else. Unfortunately, nobody knew where else. In the process, the pilots get too close to an airburst that blind them. John Rourke finds himself in a plane full of panicked people. He pulls out his, quote, ex-CIA card, his retired card, flashes his badge, tries to insert a little bit of control. Amongst his many skills, of course, is the ability to fly some planes. He's not totally confident in flying a jumbo jet, but he has some skills. So with the assistance of another person who has some modest amount of training, they're able to get the plane and they take it out southwest and end up in the New Mexico border desert or something to that effect, because as they're going along, more and more of the major cities are being annihilated. So this becomes a problem. He manages to land the plane. Once the plane's on the ground, he enlists the help of a number of people and goes to Albuquerque to find help. And unfortunately, while Albuquerque was not hit by a nuclear bomb, it was hit by a firebomb set off by the panicked mob of the people freaking out and trying to get out of town, afraid of the nukes. And somehow a local fuel refinery or something exploded, and it took out our gas system exploded, and it took out a lot of the natural gas lines, which really caused havoc across the city. And without anybody there to help put the fires out, well, those that did remain were braving mobs of people in utter panic mode who didn't know what else to do but attack everything on site and run around ransacking and looting the place, destroying stuff. So Rourke managed to find a handful of supplies, no medical supplies, no official help. And three of the four people who accompanied him decided to strike out on their own and leave him and this other fellow, this young would-be editor at a New York magazine called Paul Rubenstein. And the two of them liberate a 57 Chevy and some gas, and they start heading their way back to where the plane's at, because Rourke feels responsible. They said he would come back, and he's a man of his word. So they return, and just in time to get there as a batch of brigands basically had come across the plane and the survivors of the crash and decimated them to loot their stuff. So John Rourke takes revenge for them, not for himself, and makes mincemeat of these brigands. This begins this odyssey. At this point, John Rourke is going to try to cross what's left of the United States, to get to Georgia, to find his family, and then get them to this retreat. That's his goal in mind. And Paul Rubenstein didn't ever rode a motorcycle before, never fired a gun, let alone fired one at somebody out of intent to kill them. Is learning as he goes, and is doing fairly well. Meanwhile, the total outcome is the Americans lost. The Russians have a terrific victory. While the Soviet particle projecting weapon did work, it only worked partially as well, and there wasn't enough of them to deploy across all their major cities. So a big chunk of the Soviets' industrial capacity is obliterated, whereas a lot of the American industrial capacity is still intact, but many of its cities are eradicated and most of its workforce is dead or on the run. The Russians used neutron bombs in a number of cities, which meant that they flash fried everybody living in it and killed all the life in the vicinity, but didn't destroy the property. And the radiation levels diminished to the point so quickly that people were able to, short time later, start reoccupying these locations. So the Russians start sending in a expeditionary force to these various cities, starting with Chicago, and they set up with the intention of taking over as much as they can and trying to get the American industry in play going on. Meanwhile, the American president's trapped in a bunker, and he understands that he can't get out, and it's just inevitable before the Russians get there and dig him out. So he issues this blanket appeal to the American public to do what they can to resist and to reconstitute the America as they knew it, and then commit suicide in order to prevent him being captured and used as a tool by the Russians. This causes other problems. So now they got to find somebody, a surviving member of the U.S. government, that they can make a president, turn into a president. And in the meanwhile, we've still got more and more brigands running around. The weather's getting really wonky. There's no real government or official control, except for these would-be paramilitary groups that are starting to band together in order to fight the brigands, and then the Russians as the Russians approach. In the process of the nuclear exchange, a massive earthquake hits the west coast, and pretty much a big chunk of California breaks off and slides into the ocean. This causes tsunamis that wreaks havoc across the Pacific Ocean, across all the far shores, including places like Alaska. Later in several series of the books down the road, a major fault line in Florida is also severed, and Florida will break off and sink into the sea. Until that point, the Russians allowed their Cuban allies to take control of what was left of Florida. And why is Florida important? Well, Paul Rubenstein believes his parents were there, and his intention was to go there and try to find them and do what he could. So he stuck with Rourke until they get to a certain point. This is where Rourke and Rubenstein run across this young lady who claims to be a geologist who was out in the desert with her brother, and then they were attacked by brigands, and her brother was killed, and she was all of her stuff was taken, and she was left for dead. And this is where Rourke finds him. She turns out to be actually a KGB agent that he had had some brief encounters with in Latin America, and so on and so forth. So you can get the idea that there are plenty of scenarios where the Twilight 2000 rule set could be easily adapted to a different environment. If you ever played Twilight 2000 and you played the original series, and toward the latter part of the supplements, they started introducing modules for North America and certain areas of the world that were more about that kind of scenario. Well, once your group from Poland manages to find their way home, they come back to a devastated country that's in turmoil and in crisis, with the term country being a loose term, because there are a lot of problems, lots of division, and lots of damage to be dealt with. And so you either work with the remnants of the United States government trying to restore order and put back things back to normal, or you take the sides of one of the paramilitary groups, or you go out on your own, or you turn brigand. It's all up to you. So anyway, at the end of the day, there's always the possibility of finding creative ways to use a game system in a different manner, or to incorporate, like I said, novel series. Like I've got some 40 odd books. There was 50 in the series. I don't know if every one of my books carried through, but it's worth an experiment. So I'll read you the back so you know. For years, like millions of other Americans, John Thomas Rourke had planned for what seemed the inevitable: the destruction of civilization. There are various possible causes: global economic collapse, some uncontrolled pestilence, a world famine, or nuclear war. As the rumbling signaling of a coming total war, it was becoming increasingly strong as Rourke, ex-CIA covert operations officer, weapons expert, and survival authority, made his last desperate gambit to save his estranged wife and 2 children before the button was pressed and the missiles launched. The multi-megaton bombs loosed. Here, then, is the story of the ultimate war, the final nuclear holocaust, and the unrelenting quest of John Thomas Rourke as he begins his search across the war-ravaged America, following every haunting clue, however fragmentary, to locate his missing family. There are Soviet occupation troops, lawless, murderous brigands, and vast uncharted nuclear deserts to block his way. John Thomas Rourke has no option but to go on. He is the survivalist. So, if you look at the core books and the supporting books for Twilight 2000, everything you need there is there. So we know that you still have the Russians as a possible adversary. The difference would be is that they are a bit more, have their act a bit more together. They have a bit more resources to pull on than what the book implies. While you're lost in Poland and everybody's decimated, the U.S. government is on the other side of the coin with very, very limited resources and very limited control, and everything's in utter chaos and lots of potential adversaries. All the weapon systems are the same. All the weapon system mechanics, stats, supplies, equipment, vehicle lists, all that stuff can be applied to this kind of same survival scenario. It's just a different take on where the game's premise or the game world would be. This my thought, my opinions on this holiday, this 4th of July holiday, and I hope, like everybody else, that the world gets better and things improve. I have increasingly less confidence in this what's going on in our politics today, but that's just me and my personal opinions. And the recent actions are reversals of the attitude of the current crop of Supreme Justices is only adding to this "are you effing me" scenario that we're in. Till next time, this is Rick. I hope you guys have a great holiday and an even better year.